Hi, I'm Shay Stevens. Welcome back to part 4 of my series on the structure of behavior by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Today we're going to start part 3. We'll do part 3 in 2 videos. Today we're going to talk about the introduction and the section called structure and physics. It's on the physical, and then the vital order, the human order will be next time. So just to recap the overarching kind of theme of the book, he says our goal is to understand the relations of consciousness and nature. By nature, we understand here a multiplicity of events external to each other and bound together by relations of causality. So as I've mentioned before, causality is a big question and topic in this book. Okay, so here I have the breakdown of part 3. The title is The Physical Order, the Vital Order, the Human Order. I find this part of the book very exciting, coming from some knowledge about Gestalt theory and Gestalt as a concept, form as a concept being of interest to me. This is where he starts to really dive in. And thus far, he's been building up to his kind of thesis, and here he really starts to dive into his own thesis, where he also is starting to set himself, his own thoughts up as distinct from Kurt Goldstein. Kurt Goldstein did inspire, I think, this book in many important ways, but here I'm starting to see where Merleau-Ponty really has his own original contributions to the topic, I think. So we'll spend a lot of slides talking about the introduction to part 3 because he does really, it's really dense, and he does put a lot of important stuff in there. And then it's just the description of the 3 orders, the 3 forms of the physical, the vital, and the human. And then a very, very brief conclusion. But there's a lot of meat in the introduction to part 3. So we'll get into that. And so in the previous slide, I had put in black lettering the 2 parts that we're going to talk about today. And then the rest of part 3, which was in white, we'll talk about next time. Okay, so the beginning of the introduction to part 3, he says, Pavlov's reflexology treats behavior as if it were a thing, inserts and resorbs it into the tissue of events and relations of the universe. When we tried to define the variables on which behavior actually depends, we found them not in the stimuli taken as events of the physical world, but in relations which are not contained in the latter. From the relation which is established between 2 nuances of gray to the functional relations of instrument to goal and the relations of mutual expression in symbolic conduct. So continuing to kind of talk about what he had discussed in part 2, here he's still kind of recapping. He says, on analysis, the equivocal notion of stimulus separates into 2. It includes and confuses the physical event as it is in itself, on the one hand, and the situation as it is for the organism, on the other, with only the latter being decisive in the reactions of the animal. Against behaviorism, it has been established that the geographical environment and the behavioral environment cannot be identified. In the hierarchy of species, the efficacious relations at each level define an a priori of this species, a manner of elaborating the stimuli which is proper to it. Thus, the organism has a distinct reality which is not substantial, but structural. Again, the title, Structure of Behavior, this concept of structure. Science is not, therefore, dealing with organisms as the completed modes of a unique world, as the abstract parts of a whole in which the parts would be most perfectly contained. It has to do with a series of environments and milieu in which the stimuli intervene according to what they specify and what they are worth for the typical activity of the species considered. In the same manner, the reactions of an organism are not edifices constructed from elementary movements, but gestures gifted with an internal unity. Like that of stimulus, the notion of response separates into geographical behavior, the sum of movements actually executed by the animal in their objective relation with the physical world, and behavior properly so called, these same movements considered in their internal articulation and as a kinetic melody gifted with a meaning. In an organism, experience is not the recording and fixation of certain actually accomplished movements. It builds up aptitudes. So we talked about that last time. That is, the general power of responding to situations of a certain type by means of varied reactions which have nothing in common but the meaning. Reactions are not, therefore, a sequence of events. They carry within themselves an immanent intelligibility. Situation and reaction are linked internally by their common participation in a structure in which the mode of activity proper to the organism is expressed. Hence, they cannot be placed one after the other as cause and effect. They are two moments of a circular process. Okay, so that was all kind of recapping what he had been critiquing Pavlov and his behaviorist theory, his conditioned reflex theory. And so now we're going to get into more of the meaning of the word form. And Merleau-Ponty is going to have some critiques of the way that the Gestalt psychologists, the original co-founders of Gestalt theory, Max Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler, how they had, I would say, gotten into, maybe wavered in how they conceptualized the idea of Gestalt, of form. He wants to redirect that concept and push it further. He said he didn't think they went far enough in how they progressed in their conceptualization of Gestalt, of form. But obviously he is highly indebted to them in this work, and to Kurt Goldstein, who came from the Gestalt school in a way, at least by very close association to it. He used the Gestalt concept and he applied it to the organism. So this is a kind of, they're all links in the chain, and Gestalt did not start with the Gestalt theory co-founders. They inherited the term from Christian von Ehrenfels, and Goethe also had a role to play in the term Gestalt coming into common vocabulary in Germany. So I have a whole video on this, on the philosophical origins of Gestalt on my channel. It's the first video on my channel. But without needing to go into all that, we'll be able to see that without getting too into the nitty-gritty, Merleau-Ponty wants to talk about the word form in a way that spans across the divide between the objective and the merely subjective. It's really the resolution of the questions that he is grappling with throughout this book. It's the solution to this debate. He says we need to introduce a whole new concept of form to reconcile and holistically unite the idea and the thing, these two ends of the spectrum. And we'll talk about it a little bit, but here in this slide, I'm just giving a bit of an overview. Merleau-Ponty is going to paint the Gestalt psychologists in a certain way, and I just want to acknowledge that this is his portrayal of them, and I would be very curious to hear what their response would have been to his words, to his portrayal of them. What I will say is, if you want to get a bit of a taste of what Gestalt theory was, the primary founder, Max Wertheimer, delivered a speech on Gestalt theory to the Berlin Kant Society in 1924, and that's published. You can go read that speech, that address. He talks about idealism versus materialism and how he thinks about these philosophical questions and how Gestalt theory is meant to call out the limitations of science and the scientific method, I think in a very nuanced way. We'll see that Merleau-Ponty actually quotes that speech in this chapter, just a small part of it. But Merleau-Ponty basically says that they were too concerned with kind of empiricism and objectivity, this idea. And I think that is a very valid criticism, that it's one thing to ask, was that central to their theory? Is he leveling critiques at them that goes to the heart of their theory itself? I don't know if he himself would say that, because I think he says that it is their very theory that inspires him, and that they just didn't go far enough in their theory of form. But I do think it's clear that in practice, in what they spent their time on, in their research, it's very clear to me that all of them, including Max Wertheimer, leaned farther into this idea that there is this such immanent structure that gestalts form in such a clear and logical way. They are relatively distinct. They're not absolutely distinct things. They were not absolutists. But compared to Merleau-Ponty and what he's going to say, they were more on the end of the idea that things operate with such a logic and such a structure immanently without our needing to bring our mind into, the mind does not impose this structure into the world. It's already there in the world. So that's kind of their perspective. We just have to use our means of like measuring and tracking and describing the laws, these Gestalt laws that are very objective in basically how they talked about it. Merleau-Ponty is going to say the mind is an absolutely necessary component of the formation of a Gestalt. The Gestalt is a whole figure that forms in perception. That's what it was originally all about, was perception. And we look at that from, again, Christian von Ehrenfels. It was formed in a very similar way to Husserl's figural moment. But I think that over time, I would definitely say that the Gestalt psychologists wavered in how they kind of conceptualized the form, the Gestalt, in a way that they leaned more into objectivity and empiricism, I think, too much. So that's just a little bit of the background that's very important to know for this chapter. All right, so let's see. Okay, so he says we need to look into the notion of form. He says it is here that the notion of form would permit a truly new solution. Equally applicable to the three fields which have just been defined, it would integrate them as three types of structures by surpassing the antinomies of materialism and mentalism, of materialism and vitalism. So we look at the physical order, the vital order, the human order in this part of the book. He says the theory of form, which I think is a reference to Gestalt theory, is aware of the consequences which a purely structural conception entails and seeks to expand into a philosophy of form which would be substituted for the philosophy of substances. It has never pushed this work of philosophical analysis very far. This is because form can be fully understood and all the implications of this notion brought out only in a philosophy which would be liberated from the realistic postulates which are those of every psychology. So he says the Gestalt theorists were never willing to really escape this realist kind of psychology perspective, these realistic postulates. He says one can only fall back into the materialism or the mentalism which one wanted to surpass as long as one seeks an integral philosophy without abandoning these postulates. In other words, matter, life, and mind must participate unequally in the nature of form. They must represent different degrees of integration. and finally must constitute a hierarchy in which individuality is progressively achieved. By definition, it would be impossible to conceive of a physical form which had the same properties as a physiological form, and a physiological form which was the equivalent of a mental form. Without these distinctions among these different levels of structure, the notion of structure has been introduced in vain. So I believe what he might be referencing here is statements from people like Max Wertheimer, who said, when we look at a person, like in the speech on Gestalt theory he gave in 1924, he said things like, when we look at a person dancing, a dance full of grace and joy, we see this parallelism between the mental and the physical, that the Gestalt process that they are engaging in and how they feel and how they're thinking is aligned with the way that their body is dancing. He says, I think it's this term, he says it's Gestalt identical. And I think that this was kind of this suggestion from the Gestaltists as well, that there can be, he's going to bring this up, this idea of physical gestalts. Kohler, I believe, was the one who kind of wrote about that in earnest. He was really the one who pushed it in that way. And a lot of people had criticisms of that, and I think it is a worthwhile critique to ask, like, what does that mean compared to the original conception of Gestalt theory? What does physical Gestalt mean? Does it make sense? But it's this idea that if it's about form, structure, Gestalt, the idea that there's nothing to distinguish then the structure of the physical level from the mental level. It seems that is what Wertheimer, what Merleau-Ponty wants to distinguish. He says we need to make distinctions. So he says matter, life, and mind must participate unequally in the nature of form. They must represent different degrees of integration. The theory of form believes it has solved the problem of the relations of the soul and the body, and the problem of perceptual knowledge by discovering structural nerve processes which have the same form as the mental on the one hand and are homogeneous with physical structures on the other. Thus, no epistemological reform would be necessary, and the realism of psychology as a natural science would be definitively conserved. So again, this is a reference to the attitude of the Gestalt theorists. And I think that as someone who is familiar with them, that I do think this is an absolutely valid critique. They very much believed in empiricism, and they wanted to really, work towards establishing psychology as a natural science. That was definitely their attitude toward it. He says, thus behavior remains defined, according to the simplest of schemata, as an imitation of things. Consciousness remains a part of being. The integration of matter, life, and mind is obtained by their reduction to the common denominator of physical forms. It matters little that the ultimate explanation is always physical if the physical structures posited in nerve functioning imply relations just as complex as those which are grasped by consciousness in the actions of a living being or a man. A complex physical structure is less material than the atoms of consciousness of the old psychology. So here I think he's kind of putting words into the mouths of the Gestalt psychologists. He's saying this is what they would say. And I think this last sentence is a paraphrasing of the quote that he's about to share on the next slide from Max Wertheimer's address on Gestalt theory, saying that even something that is, quote, material, like a tree that might not have consciousness, like a human has consciousness, the complexity of the whole is still inspiring and beautiful and elegant. And that Max Wertheimer says, there are many pages of psychology textbooks that are concerned with consciousness, which are not as, elegant and soulful, you might say, So it's a very interesting speech. But Merleau-Ponty is critiquing it. So here's the quote from Max Wertheimer. If we go to the roots of our aversion to materialism and mechanism, is it the material properties of combined elements which we find? So he's asking, is our issue with materialism the material properties of elements? To speak frankly, there are psychological theories and a good many manuals of psychology which treat expressly of the elements of consciousness and are nevertheless more materialistic, inanimate, and deprived of meaning and significance than a living tree, which perhaps does not have a trace of consciousness. It matters little what material the particles of the universe are made of. What counts is the type of whole or totality, the significance of the totality, the whole. And then Merleau-Ponty asks, but can the originality of biological and mental structures be really conserved, as Gestalt theory tries to do, while at the same time founding them on physical structures? A physical explanation of behavior supposes that physical forms can possess all the properties of the biological and mental relations for which they serve as substrate. In a philosophy which denies itself material distinctions, this amounts to saying that there is no difference between the three orders, and that life and mind are different words for designating certain physical forms. Precisely if one is thinking in terms of structure, to say that physical forms in the final analysis account for human behavior amounts to saying that the physical forms alone exist. If there is no longer any structural differences between the mental, the physiological, and the physical, there is no longer any difference at all. Then consciousness will be what happens in the brain, and as a matter of fact, we see Kafka defining consciousness following the tradition of materialism as that property which certain events in nature have of revealing themselves, as if consciousness always had as objects, note the word objects, the physiological processes which accompany it. So again, it's just this critique that they were leaning so much into kind of this idea of like objectivity of nature, of a thing in itself, its nature. Events in nature have of revealing themselves versus the role that the mind plays in perception. So he says we need to distinguish the structural differences between the mental order, the physiological order, and the physical order, or else there is really no meaningful difference between them and no reason to talk about them as distinct. He says they suggest that the fact of becoming conscious adds nothing to the physical structures. It is only the index of particularly complex physical structures. It must be said of these structures, and not of consciousness, that they are indispensable to the definition of man. We do not think that the notion of Gestalt is pursued to its most important consequences, either in these materialist conclusions or in the mentalist interpretation, which we indicated at first. In reality, matter, life, and mind must be understood as three orders of significations. We would like to return to the notion of form, to seek out in what sense forms can be said to exist in the physical world and in the living body, and to ask of form itself the solution to the antinomy of which it is the occasion, the synthesis of matter and idea, so of thing, of realism, and idea or idealism. And these are the last words of the introduction. Now we'll talk about the first order, the physical order, and the next video, we'll talk about the other two sections, the vital and the human. So the section that's about the physical is titled Structure in Physics. So he talks about these three orders, the physical, the vital, and the human. He also calls them structures, levels of structure. It's a hierarchy of the three. Okay, so he says, what is demanded by the actual content of science is certainly not the idea of a universe in which everything would literally depend on everything else, and in which no cleavage would be possible. But no more so is it the idea of a nature in which processes would be knowable in isolation, and which would produce them from its resources. What is demanded is neither fusion nor juxtaposition. Rather, it is structure. So this is a very important quote in the book. Then he talks about the idea of laws. Law and structure are not distinguished in science as a real analysis and a real synthesis would distinguish them. The law of falling bodies is the expression of a property of the terrestrial field, which in reality is supported and maintained at each instant by the ensemble of the relations of the universe. Thus, the law is possible only within a de facto structure, but this latter, in turn, far from being a definitive given, the opaqueness of which would, in principle, defy analysis, can be integrated into a continuous tissue of relations. The relation of structure and law in science is a relation of reciprocal inclusion. He says, form is not an element of the world, but a limit toward which physical knowledge tends, and which it itself defines. Form, and with it the universe of history and perception, remains indispensable on the horizon of physical knowledge as that which is determined and intended by it. And here is a quote from Husserl that he has in this part of the book. Doubtless the sensible content of the perceptual given can no longer be considered as something true in itself, but the substrate, the carrier, the empty X of the perceived determinations must always be considered as that which is determined in terms of physical predicates by the exact methods. He says, thus form is not a physical reality, but an object of perception. So that's a super, super important quote and thesis of this whole book. Without it, physical science would have no meaning, moreover, since it is constructed with respect to it and in order to coordinate it. So he says, form is necessarily the object of perception. Perception is what is this necessary component of a form. We must include, in some respects, subjectivity, and it's not purely this objective thing. This idea of contrasting a thing that has its nature, what it is in itself, versus the question of what role does idea play, does mind play. He says we have to integrate these things, that the form, this concept of form, of structure, it requires perception and it requires a perspective. So, he, I think, would agree with the Gestaltists that there is immanent structure in the world. There is immanent kind of properties that are not completely imposed by the mind. So it's not 100% mind and it's not 100% nature. It's not just in itself, but there are properties, there are structures, but it's this meeting, this branching between the perception of a thing and what we see in science, in physical science. We measure things, we observe things. It's not just us creating them with our mind. It's a both and. He says, in the final analysis, form cannot be defined in terms of reality, but in terms of knowledge, not as a thing of the physical world, but as a perceived whole. So knowledge is very important. This unity is the unity of perceived objects. It is from the universe of perceived things that Gestalt theory borrows its notion of form. It is encountered in physics only to the extent that physics refers us back to perceived things, as to that which it is the function of science to express and determine. Thus, far from the physical form being able to be the real foundation of the structure of behavior, and in particular of its perceptual structure, it is itself conceivable only as an object of perception. So this slide is really like the thesis of this book. It's what he's been working up to. And it is significant, I think, that he has this wording, this unity is the unity of perceived objects. So he's still using this word object, but they are only distinct through perception. They're only determined because there is this element of perception, this perspective of the thing. It's not an object in itself, it is not absolute. So I think that this is a very important and necessary critique that Merleau-Ponty makes to kind of redirect, I think, the theory of Gestalt back to its roots in perception, to ask, why were we originally talking about perception in Gestalt theory? It's because it's not just this objective thing out there. The perception is a necessary part of the process. He says, the reference to a sensible or historical given is not a provisional imperfection. It is essential to physical knowledge. In fact and by right, a law is an instrument of knowledge, and structure is an object of consciousness. Laws have meaning only as a means of conceptualizing the perceived world. I love this quote, and I think it's a really interesting quote, that law it serves knowledge, that it's like he said earlier, and I can't remember if it was Goldstein or if it was just Merleau-Ponty. I think it might have been Goldstein who also said this, that, how did he say it? But this idea that not everything is related to everything else. Like there must be some distinction among the relations that determines what is kind of influential on this thing over here. There's a field of influence. Not everything is related to everything else in the same way. But Merleau-Ponty is saying, and Goldstein, I think, said that's why there are laws in science. So Merleau-Ponty is saying something similar here. But the fact is that laws are in reference to a certain field. Laws of science are not necessarily absolute. They can't necessarily be isolated. I think that's what he's saying here. There is a sensible or historical given is essential to physical knowledge. The givenness, the situation is important, and that's also what Max Wertheimer really cared a lot about, is the given situation, the actual lived situation. So I think that this is a really interesting quote. And so that's all for today, and next time we will pick back up with the rest of part 3. And thanks.